Okay, so we just completed preparing the data for analysis, and now we're going to move into part two, which is to do the k-means clustering. So let's share the sheet again. This is the Chipotle data set, and at this point, your data set should have 313 participants. The names of the restaurants should be all standardized so that each restaurant's name is spelled in one way and only one way. You should have, in addition to the original data for these 313 participants, you should have 21 additional columns, each one representing one restaurant, and underneath dummy variables that indicate whether that participant in that row chose that restaurant as their restaurant that they visited most within the past 6 months. This is an answer to question number one. Okay, so next, one other thing, you should have a column. The first column should be called participant, and it should have numbers 1 through, 313. So now we're going to do k-means clustering. I've given you the K for this assignment, which is 3. We're going to do 3 clusters. The next assignment, you're going to have to make a choice between 3 or 4 clusters. But for this assignment, for the in-class exercise, you are going to do clusters based in 3 clusters. By now, if you're not familiar at all with how to do cluster analysis in Excel, watch the brief YouTube video that is in the assignment. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a little table to the right. I'm going to start with cell AZ. You'll see an example in the in-class exercise document. If you scroll down, there's a screenshot where a table, in each row in that table, you're going to have center 1, center 2, center 3, and in the columns, you're going to have female, age, and income. So if I do this, it doesn't have to be in the same cells as I am doing, but I'm going to type it starting in cell AW. So here's my table, center 1, center 2, and center 3. Those are going to be centroids for each of the 3 clusters we're going to do analysis around. And in the columns, type in, this is representing the demographic variables, female, age, and income. And then in these cells, you're going to put in the values for 3 participants to represent your starting values for your centroids and the cluster analysis. Remember, the centroids are the center data point or the average of each cluster. Now, we don't know what the clusters are going to be yet, so we're going to randomly choose 3 values. The best practice is to pick three data points. Each person represents a data point, or each fictional person represents a data point that is as far away from each other as possible. So that helps the cluster analysis to find the clusters faster. So in this example, we're going to just use the gender, age, and income for the first 3 participants in the data set because they happen to be far apart. So you see the ages. You have a 33-year-old, a 37-year-old, a 52-year-old. The 33 and the 37-year-old maybe are a little close to each other, but the 52-year-old is far apart. But given that their income is so different, almost 21,000, 41,000, a little bit over 41, and 86,000, these are very different. So in terms of collectively, even though they're all female and the 2 of them are in the 30s, collectively, these people are a little bit different in terms of characteristics. They're a bit far apart, especially based on the income. So let's use these 3 to be our starting points. And then the cluster analysis will update these centers based on the iteration. So I'm going to copy the values from those, paste it into my table. I'm just gonna did paste special and then values, and then we have that here. And then next to that, I'm going to create another table. based on the instructions. Okay. And so that is what we did for number 10 and number 11. So step 12, create a new table to the right where the first column is labeled participant. Fill this column with the numbers of the participants and then place center 1, center 2, and center 3 as the next 3 columns, min as the 4th column, and cluster as the 5th column. And so you see an example of this as a screenshot. If you scroll down in the assignment, in the in-class exercise, you see the top of that table. I'm going to start typing that here. Participants. First column, let's take center 1, center 2, center 3. If you do copy and then select the cell, and then like we did last time, we're going to do paste special, and then we're going to click on transpose. That copies that over. And then the next column should say min. And the next column should say cluster. And then in the column that's labeled participant, we're going to recreate those numbers of the participants. So I'm going to come over, I'm going to copy all the data in this column. That covers all our participants in the survey. And I'm going to paste it here. Let's go ahead and save our work. So that completes the step 12. And then in step 13, now in the columns that are labeled as center 1, we're going to enter in our Euclidean distance formula. This is going to be the formula that's going to measure the distance between one point and one data point and another. So it's basically the distance between one participant and another participant, or in this case, more specifically, the distance between one participant and a center, which could be becomes the center for some cluster. So what is the distance between participant 1 and this center? What is the distance between participant 1 and the center 2 and center 3? This is the way where we can see how far is a participant away from each center of a cluster, and that will help us to assign that person to a cluster. The shortest distance between the participant and a center would indicate that that participant should belong to that cluster. So let's go ahead and enter that formula. The formula is given an example of in step 13. We're going to use the absolute value formula. This is saying what's the absolute value of, in this case, the difference between the center, the first variable in center 1, and the variable for participant 1 in terms of female. So here's your center. I'm sorry, let me start with, let's find the value. What is the participant, for participant 1, what is their gender? So let's go find that column for gender. For participant 1, minus, what is the average value for gender, for female, I should say, for center 1. And then we'll have close brackets. And because we're going to be copying this formula down for all the participants, we're going to make sure it's always comparing it to the value for center 1. So we're going to put in $signs. Okay. We're going to do the same thing for age and income. So absolute value for participant 1, age, minus what is the center of cluster. This is representing cluster 1 for now. what is supposed to be right now the average value of age for that cluster. These values in these centers are going to be updated with each iteration, because ultimately when we assign people to each cluster, we're going to calculate the averages for that group. Let's put in the $signs. And then we're going to do it for the third variable, income. For participant 1, let's see what their income is. Let's put in apps for absolute value. Here's their income minus what is the average for the cluster. This helps us to see how close participant 1 is to cluster 1. And we're going to compare that to how close participant 1 is to the center of cluster 2 and the center of cluster 3. And whichever is the shortest distance based on this formula, that's the cluster we're going to assign to participant 1 to. Okay. And so what we get here for center 0 is 0. Why is that? Because these were the values, we copy these values directly from participant 1. This is participant 1's gender. 0 means that this person is a male. 1 means they're a female. This person is 52 years old. Participant 1 has this income. So we're comparing participant 1 to the center of the cluster, which is based on participant 1. So of course, the distance is going to be 0. Now, what we're going to do is copy this formula and update it for center 2 and center 3. And in fact, okay, so I went inside and copied the contents because we still want the same participant. So we want T2, U2, and V2, which represents the gender, age, and income for participant 1. But now we want to update it in here. References for the center, the centroid of cluster 2. This is cluster 2. We want to update this so that this refers to the average value for gender in cluster 2. We got to put in the $signs to fix it so that we can copy it down to other participants. We want to update the reference for age in cluster 2. We want to put in the $signs. And then we want to update the reference for cluster 3 income, cluster 2 income. But we're evaluating still participant 1. So these references don't change to calculate the distance for cluster 2. And we see that we have a value here. So clearly participant 1 is much closer to cluster 1 and center 1 than to cluster 2. I'm going to do the same thing for center 3. So I'm just going to update these fixed values so that it represents cluster 3 with its center. So that's just going to change this to a 4 to represent row 4. And you can see from these values here, participant 1 is furthest away from cluster 3 because it has the largest distance. It's participant 1 is not as far, but still far from cluster 2. So participant 1 clearly belongs to cluster 1. So this column is supposed to reveal what out of these 3 distances is the minimum distance, because that's going to be the basis for which cluster you go to. So I'm going to type in the formula minimum and select these 3. And then I'm going to use this value to reveal ultimately what cluster this participant should be assigned to. And we see visually it's going to be cluster 1, but we're going to use formulas to help us calculate that for us every single time. Okay, so in order to help us, the formulas tell automatically which cluster is the cluster that has the shortest distance. I'm going to use the match formula here. And if you go to step 16, it talks about using the match formula in the in-class assignment. So type in match. The first entry should be, what is the value that the match is looking up? And in this case, it's going to look up this distance, the minimum distance, and it's going to figure out which column is the minimum distance. So then here I'm going to select BF, the cell BF2 shows the minimum distance. Click a comma. Now it's saying, well, what is it? What is the array that I'm searching in to match against? Select all 3 values here, which are the distances that participant 1 is from center 1, center 2, center 3. These are the centers of the 3 clusters. So we're going to select that, and then do comma, and then type in 0 because you want an exact match. 0 represents an exact match. Close parentheses, enter. And what this is saying is it's detecting based on looking for this value and matching. It's saying the first of the 3 in the array, first column, is where is the assignment for this participant. Okay, great. So now that you've done all of this, we can take and copy these down to all the other participants. And remember, with these centers, it's important that you have the $ in the appropriate places because we want each participant evaluated against the same table. So I'm going to copy down for all the other participants. All the way down to the 313th participant. Here we go. And so all these forms are automatically calculating the distance of each participant from these 3 centers, these 3 clusters, and it's showing in this last column what cluster they've been assigned to in this iteration. Let's go ahead and save our work so we don't lose it. And so now the next step is, now that we have a first iteration of participants assigned to a cluster, now we're going to calculate the averages of gender, age, and income for the people within each cluster. Those averages of gender, age, and income for the people in each cluster are going to be used to update what is considered the center of the cluster. We're going to update these values with the averages that we calculate from people who are assigned to each cluster. Once we do that, then we're going to update the distances again. And because we have formulas here, it's automatically going to update based on these cells. These distances will update and will be recalculated. And as a result, it's going, with these cells, it's going to reassign people to new clusters. And then we will see, did the assignments to the new clusters match the assignments from the prior iteration? So I'm going to do one more thing in preparation of that. Let's call this, let's go to step 18. First, we're going to step 17, copy and paste the cluster column to the right of the table so that the information is not lost when we change the column. This column with the formulas is going to change each time we update this table with new averages. So let's copy this. And let's call this last cluster. We're going to paste just the values, not the formulas, just the values, so we know exactly what was said. So we're going to say paste a special, and then we're going to select values. And let's call this last cluster. Oops. So right now these are exactly the same, and that's okay. But what we're going to do each time is compare the current cluster to the last cluster after the first iteration. As long as there are any differences, we know we have to do another iteration where we recalculate the averages and update. As soon as we get to a point where nothing has changed after an iteration, we know we can stop. So we're going to call this maybe difference between current cluster and last cluster. Right now, it's going to be 0. It's just, but type in the formula that's simply, oops, minus. Okay. We're going to do the cluster value in this cell minus the cluster value in this cell. We're going to copy that down. And we're going to do iterations until, right now it'll be 0, but we're going to keep doing iterations until it's 0 again. Okay. And go ahead and save your work. Okay, so what we just did was we copied the first cluster assignment, which is in this column versus cluster. We copied and pasted just the values, no formulas like you have here, just the values by doing copy. Or let's select just the values. We did right click, copy, and then we created a new column called last cluster. If you do right click on your mouse and select paste special and select values, because we don't want the formulas, we copied over. And these are this is going to become our last value. And then we created a new column, which is difference, to calculate the difference between the two. Now this is iteration 1. Now what we're going to do is we're going to update these values in our centers by calculating the averages of all the people that have been assigned to cluster 1. What is the average in terms of the binary variable for female, the average in terms of age and income. Let's add a new column. We're going to call this cluster so that we know for sure what this is. Cluster 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and we're going to use leverage. I am now at step 18. We're going to use the formula called average if to help us average based on which cluster people are in. So for the first cell, I'm going to show an example, and then we're going to copy this formula over to the other cells. Enter in average if, and then the first argument in average if is what range is it evaluating based on some criteria. So in our case, we want it to evaluate the column called last cluster. Select this entire column. For the last cluster, it's important you select the last cluster, which has just values, and you do not select the column for cluster, which has formulas, because it will create an error called a circular argument. So we're going to take the last cluster and put that range in for all 313 participants, put in a comma. And then what is the criteria? Well, for this first row, we want to have the average values for the variable female for all of those in cluster 1. So our criteria is we have a column here. This is clusters. We're going to select the cell for cluster 1, which is the number 1. So as long as in column BH here, you have a 1 here, it's going to take that person that has a 1 and include them in the average value for female. And then put a comma, and then the last argument is what is it? It's asking average range, which is what exactly am I averaging? We want to average the values of female for all people in cluster 1. So we want to select the column for female, which is column T. And we're going to select all the values in column T. Of course, don't select the label at the top. So here are the values for the 313 participants, and then we'll close parentheses. Now we're going to do one more thing, is we're going to put in dollar signs to fix some of the references so that we can copy it over to the other cells. So we always want all the average ifs for each of these cells to evaluate this column last cluster. So I'm going to put $signs both in front of the letters and the numbers in the range. You do function in your keyboard. For those who are using DOS-based systems, function F4, that'll automatically put all the $signs in for you, both in front and after the letters in the range. For the second one, because I'm going to be copying the cell to the right, I just want to have a $sign in front of the letter range so that it won't move, but I wanted to be able to copy across rows. And in the third cell, since this column represents female, I'm going to put $signs in front of the numbers because I want to be able to copy it over for age. So put the $signs not in front of the T's, the letters, but in front of the numbers. And now we're done. And now it's showing what the average response was for people in cluster 1 who have age. Now we're going to copy this over to cluster 2 and cluster 3. And that's showing the average response for those who are included in cluster 2, cluster 3. And then we're going to copy this over into the age column and the income column. So now we see averages. So all people in cluster 1, here's the average response of those with 1s. Let me reduce the number. I'm just formatting it so that we see 2 decimal places. For age, cluster 1, the average is 36 years old, 36.94 years. And then here's the average income for everybody in cluster 1. Here it is for everybody in cluster 2 and cluster 3. So these are now the new centroids, the new centers of these clusters. Now the question is, do we need to iterate again? Well, it depends on whether, because now we have our formula set up, everybody has been reassigned to new clusters based on these new centroids. Let's look to see if in the difference column, if there are any differences. So to help us determine if there are any differences, I'm going to do special formatting on this column where it will highlight whenever there's any values in here other than 0. Let's do this. I'm going to select all these values. And I'm going to go to conditional formatting at the top. I'm going to select highlight cell rules where it's going to highlight if it meets a condition. And I'm going to say if let's see, let's do more rules. What I want to say for the cell in this column BI is not equal to 0, which means there's a difference between the last assignment of clusters and the current iteration of clusters. Then I want cell to highlight that cell. So I'm going to say OK. And what we should see now, let's try this again, is it should highlight a color. Let's try this again. Format, highlight cell rules. Rules. If the cell is not equal to 0, then I want the format to have some kind of color. Let's choose yellow. Hit OK. And let's see if that works. Now, we see that it has automatically highlighted participants who were switched into some other cluster, which means we are not done and we need to iterate again. So how do we iterate again? What I'm going to do is simply copy the current clusters that they have been assigned to. This is in the cluster column. And then I'm going to paste the values into the columns called last cluster. Paste special values. Do not paste the formulas. Paste the values. And now that becomes the clusters they were assigned to in the last iteration. And formulas will automatically update now the centroids for the base. based on that, and people will be assigned new clusters based on these new centroids. And we see now there's less differences, highlighted 0, less yellow. Now we only see a couple people that were switched clusters compared to the last iteration. So we need to do it again. I'm going to copy the new updated assignments that people have been placed in. I'm going to paste these into the last cluster column, paste special value. We only want the values. That copies over. So now this is what it's doing now, is updating cluster assignments. It's assigning people to the closest centroid based on the updated centroids. Let's see if we see any yellow now to indicate. As we see here, this happened in 3 iterations. We see here now, there are no cells highlighted in yellow. Everything is 0 in terms of difference between the last cluster and the current cluster. What that means is nobody has been switched to a new cluster now, and therefore the cluster analysis has been stabilized, and we're done with our k-means clustering with this information. Let's save our work. And so now everybody's been assigned to cluster, and here are the 3 clusters with their centroids. So this is saying that for cluster 1, on average, we have 0.22, which means that 22% of the respondents are female, everybody else is male. The average age is 38, almost 39 years old, and the average income is almost $23,000. Cluster 2, 19% of them are female, because the average of the dummy variables is 0.19. Age is 41, a little bit over 41 years old. They have a higher income, almost $47,000. And then center 3, cluster 3, 26% are female. Average age is 42 years old. The average income is almost $78,000. As you can see from these demographic variables, the biggest differentiator between the 3 clusters is income. So we're done with cluster analysis here. We've set up a spreadsheet with formulas that will facilitate in updating the cluster assignments. And that brings us to, that covers all the way up through steps 21. At this point in time, now the rest of part 3 is more about interpretation of the results that we have here, and investigate the requesters that you have, profile them. That's question 23. And then calculate the mean outcome variables for the Chipotle visits. That's question 24. Let's do that fairly quickly. So if we want to calculate what is the average visits for cluster 1 and cluster 2 and cluster 3, what you can do is you can still use the average if formula, which has been very advantageous to us. So let's enter in here column for Chipotle visits, and let's copy one of the formulas over. And what we're going to update is we're going to still keep the first argument, which refers to the last cluster, which is the current cluster assigned to. We're still going to keep the second argument because we're talking about cluster 1. I want to find the average for cluster 1. What we're going to do is update this third argument by finding what column shows how many visits they made to Chipotle. This is column G that shows how many visits they made to Chipotle. And so let's update this with G in this argument. And then we'll copy down this formula to each of the clusters. And so those for cluster 1, on average, they made 0.35 visits. Why is it 0.35? Because there are many people in that cluster who never visited Chipotle. Same thing in cluster 2 and cluster 3. These are the average number of visits. And so for question number 24, for each cluster. What is, so this added as a new column for your mean table, which we did here. And now you're able to answer for question 24, that these are the average number of visits, the mean number of visits by cluster. So question 25, you're going to do the same thing for the variables of WOM, for social media, SM, walk, and billboard. And so if we're going to add 4 new columns to our mean table, which I'm going to do here, I'm going to insert 2, 3, 4 new columns. What you can do is just select those columns, right click on your mouse, click on insert. Actually, let's put a space in so that there's some space. And let's call these new columns WOM, SM, walk, and billboard. Just as you did with the Chipotle visits, you can copy the formula over and update the last argument by replacing the references with the column letter for these variables. So we have C, D, E, and F for word of mouth, social media, walk, and billboard. And so that's what we're going to do, C, D, E, and F. Let's update this with C. And then we can, if we copy it over, it'll automatically update the D, E, and F. And then let's copy it down for each of the clusters. And now we see average responses by cluster to the questions about how do they hear about Chipotle, word of mouth, social media, walk, and billboard. As you can see with this one, for example, it looks like hardly anybody in cluster 2 heard about Chipotle through social media, which is quite different from clusters 1 and 3, as an example. So these begin to provide the basis for differentiating between the clusters in terms of how they're hearing about Chipotle. Okay. And with that, that was question 25, and that concludes the work, the analytical work that's needed for in-class exercise 1. You're not quite done with the exercise. You need to make sure that you've answered the questions in terms of interpreting some of the work that you've done. So at this point, go through the questions, make sure you have answered the questions, but this concludes the workshop on the analysis using k-means clustering to support a segmentation, targeting, positioning exercise. It's important that you keep the data that you have cleaned and prepared with you, and you're going to use this same data set after it's been cleaned and prepared to do assignment 2. In that particular assignment, you're going to still do k-means clustering on this exact same data set, but you're going to include psychographic variables and do clustering based on that. All right, good luck. And don't forget to upload in your submission for the in-class assignment. You're going to upload the spreadsheet, and you're going to upload in a document the answers to the questions in the assignment. Take care. Bye-bye.